I'm Susan George. I'm the honorary president of Attac France, and I've been a member since the very beginning of Attac. I was extremely pleased by the concept. Otherwise, I am the board president of the Transnational Institute, which is a worldwide fellowship of scholar activists, of people who are researchers and writers, but they are also active in the social movements of their respective countries. And I'm a writer, that's my main occupation. The causes started a long time ago. The whole neoliberal doctrine, which says you have to privatize everything and you have to trust to the private sector and you can borrow because the market will always go up, and that you must reduce the capacity of the state to intervene, all of these things, that the market will self-regulate because the market is all-knowing and all-seeing, and it will be in a state of equilibrium no matter what happens. All of this being complete rubbish, of course. And this doctrine was accepted, and it has created a huge number of inequalities, but it has also given enormous power to the financial sector, which now runs the world, basically. I like to describe this as a series of concentric spheres. I see finance on the outside as being the driving force. It's driving the real economy, and it is telling that real economy which direction it has to go. Then those two together are telling society what it must do. And at last and least important today is the environment, which is simply treated by the economy and by finance as a place where we get our natural resources and where we can throw away our wastes. What is the more recent cause of the financial crisis? In one word, it's debt. In one word, it is the fact that both private and public entities have built up a great deal of debt. It is the fact that the banks in the United States took different kinds of debt. They put them together in a big financial cauldron, in a big financial marmite, and they stirred them together. And there were in that marmite, in that cauldron, there were student loans and automobile loans and credit card loans, and above all, there were housing loans, mortgages. And they acted as a backup for securities that were created by these banks. They put all these debts together, they mix them in this big cauldron, they take out the mixture, they chop it up, and in slices of sausage like that, and they sell them on to other customers saying, you will be paid back, you will get a return of X%. It was debt, and using debt as the backup for all these toxic securities, these toxic slices of sausage based only on debt, called collateralized debt obligations. That's the fancy name for them, because the collateral was supposed to be all of these debts packaged together. And beyond a certain point, you can't base an economy on debt. There always has to be a relationship with the real economy, with how much people are actually making, with what is the distribution of that money. And if you've spent 30 years putting all the money way up in the stratosphere where the richest people live, you don't leave much for the rest of the society, and you have a lot of people who are extremely borderline and who cannot keep up their payments under any circumstances. That's why they're called subprime mortgages. The prime mortgage is for the middle or upper class who can afford to make a payment every month. The subprime is under the prime, and they were simply unable to pay. Even throughout the 60s, there were regulatory agencies, or there were semi-public companies like the mortgage companies Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, which you've probably seen their names in the papers. And there were public enterprises that were supposed to keep all of this ticking over and not not get out of hand. But the banks spent a lot of money. The best calculation I've seen is they spent about $5 billion over the years getting rid of this legislation. They got rid of 12 major barriers to their full expansion. Of course, the politicians like Bush put people in the regulatory agencies that didn't think regulation was a good thing, so they sat on their hands. They didn't do anything. Maybe the worst in terms of the world situation is that they got rid of a law which regulated the commodities markets, in particular the wheat, corn, soya, all those crop markets. When the big speculators, the hedge funds, the banks, all of the people with a lot of spare cash, figure out that the subprime market is going to crash, they get out of that market and they go into commodities and they buy huge numbers of wheat or soya or corn contracts. They don't have any intention of ever taking delivery on all that wheat, but they think that they can make a fast dollar out of it. And so, for example, one day in 2008, the price of wheat went up by 31% in one day. Now, this is not a question of supply and demand. This has nothing to do with the underlying commodity. And this was a tragedy because that meant that there were hundreds of thousands, millions of people in the world who were having to pay suddenly twice or three times as much for their staple food because the United States dominates the market and it fixes the world price, basically. So this was a tragedy, but it was also because this so-called commodities markets Modernization Act, whenever they want to deregulate, they call it modernization or reform, just deregulated the whole industry. The case of Iceland was one in which a private bank, two major private banks, were selling a lot of securities, saying that they were going to give high percentages, and they marketed these things, particularly in Britain and in Holland, and some gullible people just put a whole lot of savings into them, and it was a kind of pyramid scheme. They would pay back their first customers with what they got coming in regularly. But once again, the main word to remember is debt. They created debts for themselves, at which they said they would reimburse them at fantastic interest rates. So the naive investor put money into that, and then of course there's a point when those banks collapse. And the Icelandic people were very wise to reject paying back to the British or the Dutch or to anyone else the fact that these banks had behaved in a totally irresponsible manner. Goldman Sachs is accused of fraud on the Greek case, that they bet against the Greek bonds, a complicated financial mechanism. But it came down to the following. Let's say that I can buy an insurance policy on my neighbor's house, and then I burn down that house, and then I get the money from the insurance company. Well, that's illegal, of course, but it's not illegal in the financial world. And the banks have been betting, and Goldman undoubtedly did this. They're saying, no, not at all. We are doing the Lord's work. We are totally honorable citizens. But it's clear that they were betting against the Greek debt, and they were in the position to take out insurance that the Greek debt would go down, and it was like a self-realizing prophecy. When the Greek debt exploded, they made a lot of money. They burnt down the house, and they collected the money. It's hurting people's lives. It's reducing the quality and the quantity of public services. the government cannot continue to pay for the banks, but also provide for a welfare state. So, of course, it's the people who are paying. It's always the people who pay. It's always the weakest link. It's not the minority with power. It's always the weakest part of the society. Unfortunately, until citizens get organized and get mad together and put pressure on their governments, they will do as little as possible. And let's not forget that our governments are also very close to the banks. Certainly the German government and the French government are much more interested in what happens to the banks than they are in what happens to ordinary citizens, unfortunately. But that's the reality of politics today. We don't have to solve the banking crisis in this way. What I propose is that any bank which has received public money is socialized totally or partially, and that there is a mandate that they must henceforward devote X% of their portfolios to loans to small and medium businesses and to people who have an ecological project, because we know from several reports that it is the green economy that will provide the solution to the unemployment crisis. And I think unless we can get the banks under control, but we're a long way from that, that we will continue to let them run amok. They will make their own laws, which is what they have been doing for the last 15 years. You know what they're already selling, the banks? They're buying up insurance policies of terminally ill people or people who are old and really sick. And statistically, what they're counting on is that these people will die quite early and they will make enormous profits. And they are now selling these things the way they sold collateralized debt obligations on subprimes or on whatever other kind of debt. And they will continue to invent these exotic products, and they will continue to find ways to commodify everything. I think commodifying sickness and death is going pretty far. Unless you get that sort of thing under control, unless you say that credit default swaps are illegal, unless you say you can't buy the equivalent of an insurance policy on your neighbor's house, burn down the house and collect the money, unless you can do all of that, they will continue to invent ways of enriching themselves. If you open the door and you let the children into the candy store and say, you know, stay here and eat as much as you want, that's what they'll do. Already last year, Goldman Sachs, which is now the bank everybody loves to hate, but last year there were 131 working days where they made over $100 million during the day. So, I mean, you can either say, okay, Goldman, you can go on doing that, or you can say an enormous number of these products have no social value whatsoever, on the contrary, and you can get them under control. But I see very few signs that the G20 is taking any of this very seriously. They will regulate around the edges because people are angry, but they're not going to do anything basic, so we'll come to another crisis sooner or later. Activists, of people who are researchers and writers, but they are also active in the social movements of their respective countries. And I'm a writer, that's my main occupation. The causes started a long time ago. The whole neoliberal doctrine, which says you have to privatize everything and you have to trust to the private Susan George. I'm the honorary president of Attac France, and I've been a member since the very beginning of Attac. I was extremely pleased by the concept. Otherwise, I am the board president of the Transnational Institute, which is a worldwide fellowship of scholar acts. And this doctrine was accepted, and it has created a huge number of inequalities, but it has also given enormous power to the financial sector, which now runs the world, basically. I like to describe this as a series of concentric spheres. I see finance on the outside as being the driving force. It's driving the real economy, and it is telling that real economy which direction it has to go. Then those two together are telling society what it must do. And at last and least important today is the environment, which is simply treated by the economy and by finance as a place where we get our natural resources and where we can throw away our wastes. What is the more recent cause of the financial crisis? In one word, sector, and you can borrow because the market will always go up, and that you must reduce the capacity of the state to intervene. All of these things, that the market will self-regulate because the market is all-knowing and all-seeing, and it will be in a state of equilibrium no matter what happens. All of this being complete rubbish, of course.